This presentation is about frog deformities stemming from the chemical herbicide atrazine. In 1995, more than 50% of frogs collected from Ney Pond near Henderson, Minnesota were grotesquely deformed, missing legs or having extra legs, eyes, or multi-sectional forked limbs, reports Stephanie Hemphill of Minnesota Public Radio. Of 13,000 northern leopard frogs, the most common species of frog in Minnesota, collected over the next few years, deformities were 4.5 to 6.5% higher when contrasted with what is usual in populations of frogs. Other frog populations in the northeast and northwestern United States and up into Canada were also found to have higher proportions of deformities. Why this matters is that amphibians, like frogs, are particularly vulnerable given their multi-stage development, their migration of environments, and selectively permeable skin. Frogs are regarded by many scientists, like Eric Chevian and Aaron Bernstein, the authors of Sustaining Life, as a sentinel species, and they are metaphorically the canary in the coal mine because their development is from tadpole to frog, aquatic to terrestrial, and back to water again, and because their skin absorbs much of what it touches. They are particularly vulnerable to their environments because they are literally in contact with it. If frogs show problems stemming from their environments, it is thought likely that other species, and we too, will eventually suffer similar problems. Predators account for missing or withered limbs because at some stages, tadpoles can regenerate missing tissue. But what causes extra limbs and eyes? Parasite invasion? Riberia condyarthrae, which is a trematode flatworm, can harbor in snails before attacking tadpoles, which accounts for their deformations. But this deformation or maiming is only likely at a certain stage of the tadpole's development. It is also thought that cysts caused by the parasites are responsible for the abnormalities of extra appendages. None of the sources I found could conclusively account for extra eyes in frogs. In Minnesota, only first-year frogs were found, so it was either the first year that deformities occurred, or previous years deformed frogs died before noticed by the scientific community. Given the extent of some of the deformities, it is easy to deduct that they were easy prey. Frog deformities in Minnesota were observed when amphibian populations around the world saw a quick, substantial, dramatic drop. Some scientists believe that up to 120 different amphibian species disappeared during the 1980s, and that currently a third of amphibian species are at risk for extinction. It is not conclusive that the deformities caused the population's nosedive. Stephanie Hemphill of NPR reports that many experts believe habitat loss is the biggest cause of declining populations. Part of that loss is due to humans inserting chemical herbicides into that habitat. Chemicals can weaken the immune system of frogs, so they are more vulnerable to parasites. Eutrophication, when excess nutrients like nitrogen from herbicides enter water systems, can lead to an increase in the density of snail populations, thus hosting more of the infectious parasites. Hemphill explains, lakes and farm country loaded with extra nutrients from runoff may produce more snails, the parasite's alternate hosts. Atrazine, one of the most commonly used herbicide-pesticides in the United States, prevents broadleaf weeds, especially in the industrial farming of corn. It seems to play a role as an endocrine disruptor, meaning it changes animals' natural hormone systems as well. It will contaminate groundwater, and it is linked to birth defects in humans. Where used in highest levels, women in Texas were 80 times more likely to give birth to infants with choanal atresia or stenosis, according to Wikipedia. Newly hatched tadpoles exposed to atrazine showed heart defects, kidney problems, and impaired digestive systems. Dr. Carrie Krieger notes that peer-reviewed studies reveal frogs exposed to atrazine can develop delayed puberty, impaired fertility, testicular lesions, reduced anti-predator behavior, decreased cellular immunity, and that 10% of males develop into females. This decreased cellular immunity may account for the higher susceptibility to parasitic infection. The Johnson lab reports that malformed frogs do not survive to sexual maturity, likely succumbing to predators and/or starvation, and Riberaria infection is highly lethal to amphibian larvae. But what is the connection between herbicides and parasitic invasion and infection? Scientist J.M. Kissicker conducted an experiment in which wood frog tadpoles were put in ponds having snails infected by trematode parasites, which cause the missing or extra limbs in frogs. Some tadpoles were put in containers with a mesh open enough for the parasites to penetrate and infect the tadpoles, while another group of tadpoles were in a container with a much finer mesh, too small for the parasites to penetrate and infect the tadpoles. The ponds themselves were close to agricultural areas and had measurable levels of pesticides. In the finer mesh containers, none of the tadpoles developed deformities. Deformities were found in the tadpoles in the larger mesh containers, and, quote, deformities were strikingly less common in ponds that were uncontaminated by pesticides, end quote. The results were conclusive in that frog deformities from parasites are more common in the environments contaminated by pesticides, quote, because contaminant-exposed frogs are less able to resist parasite infection, end quote. Frogs becoming impotent or intersexual, and with other physical deformities handicapping their abilities to escape predators, will only lead to a further decline in the frog population. Adding in the factor of climate change means that parasites are more likely to respond better to higher temperatures than their hosts, so there will be even more defects and deaths in frogs. Ecologist David K. Skelly found that the majority of frog deformities in Connecticut were around cities and suburbs, not farms, and that the deformities were probably not from a single chemical, but a host of them, acting like estrogen, causing intersexual characteristics. Still, he's confident that the deformities are the results of human activity. Alex Avery, from the Center for Global Food Issues, says that we should use atrazine because if we don't use chemical herbicides, then we resort to mechanical herbicide, tilling, which will result in soil erosion. Soil erosion, though, still seems preferable to soil pollution from chemical herbicide runoff and amphibians susceptible to lower reproductive rates and perhaps extinction. Biologist Keith Solomon, funded by Syngenta, the manufacturer of atrazine, admitted that there is uncertainty when it comes to causal relationships between atrazine and amphibian health, stating that the effects are many but inconsistent. The EPA approved atrazine for farming, stating that it, quote, does not adversely affect amphibian gonadal development, end quote, but that statement is based, in part, on studies by Syngenta, so there may be a conflict of interests here. Interventions. Initially, deformed frog embryos were found to grow in the tap water itself around Henderson, Minnesota. Then, charcoal filters got rid of what caused the deformed embryos, but later interpretation of the original embryo and tap water study determined the results were actually inconclusive, says Stephanie Hemphill of NPR. The EPA says that atrazine can be removed from filtered out or of drinking water by using granular activated carbon. But is it feasible? Charcoal filters or sand beds can be the last stage of water treatment centers, but by then, atrazine has already filtered into the topsoil, through the groundwater, and it seems impossible to filter the runoff. Besides, monetary costs would be incalculable. Dr. Carrie Krieger suggested that removing atrazine from the market will insignificantly affect crop yields for farmers. Indeed, this was done in Europe. While manufacturers of atrazine are unlikely to be willing to take such a financial loss, they might be tempted to take another tack, taking notice of what has been discovered at the University of Minnesota. Scientific-minded entrepreneurs Alex Johansson and Joel Mullenbach discovered that bacterium of Anthrobacter has proven effective in consuming atrazine, chemically breaking it down so as to render it harmless. Why it matters. If frogs disappear, then biodiversity suffers. A decrease in frogs will affect predators' diets. Mammals like foxes and other amphibians like turtles, fish, and birds all lose a source of food. A continuous drop in frog population will ultimately result in more insects and more disease-carrying insects, leading to more humans infected. And the dilution effect is missing. Given their diets incorporating the consumption of insects, frogs are a natural, green pesticide. Conclusion. Barton Seaver's April 15th lecture provides a syllogism. We can't be any healthier than our food, and our food can't be any healthier than its environment. Therefore, we can't be any healthier than our environment. Our environment is suffering because of the widespread use of atrazine. As a vital link in biodiversity, amphibians are decimated. And is there a cumulative effect up the food chain? There has been in parallel links of the chain, and given the connection between mothers exposed to high levels of atrazine and their children with birth defects, it makes sense to eliminate the use of atrazine.